Okay, welcome. So today I wanted to offer some reflections about AI and boarding schools and to ask the question, will boarding schools become obsolete with the advent of AI? So enjoy. So I was listening to Daniel Goleman speak yesterday. It's a new talk. So this book was originally written in 1995, and he was just saying on there the difference between IQ and EQ. So IQ is, our intellect, cognitive abilities, and then you've obviously got EQ, which is more of your emotional intelligence, your ability to feel, have empathy, self-reflection. And what he was saying, and I just thought it was very fascinating. He says that cognitive ability he said maybe AI will take on more and more of the cognitive ability. But he says EQ is a human ability and will always remain so. Now, why I feel this is really important is that boarding schools, they teach IQ, they teach the cognitive ability. Yes, there's the character building side, you have the physical side, but most of the impetus is on that intellect, the mind. There is it's maybe changed a little bit now, but in all the biographies I've read, there's no link to emotional intelligence, none. So what Daniel Goleman talks about in here, he says that basically IQ accounts for 20% of life success, 20%. The other 80% is emotional intelligence. And he kind of outlines the four key areas of emotional intelligence: knowing one's emotions, managing emotions, motivating oneself, and then you've also got recognizing emotion in others, which is basically empathy, and handling relationships. And basically, I'm going to read through a couple of biographies and just explore how, there is no link to emotional intelligence in these schools, and why I feel this is kind of linked in. Will boarding schools become irrelevant and obsolete over the next 5 to 10 years is because they do not teach emotional intelligence. There's no space for empathy. There's no space for self-reflection. Maybe this is changing, but they've got to change. If they don't, I feel AI will take over the cognitive side, and all the books I've got. I mean, I've got about 10 books here. I won't go into all of them, but let's begin with Bear Grylls. So Bear Grylls, in his book here, he says, "I missed my mum and dad terribly, and on the occasional night where I felt this worst, I remember trying to muffle my tears in my pillow whilst the rest of the dormitory slept. In fact, I was not alone in doing this. Almost everyone cried, but we all learned to hide it, and those who didn't were the ones who got bullied." A similar experience to me at boarding school. I've shared this before. Is first time I cried after I'd been there about 3 weeks. Everyone in the dormitory came into my cubicle and started shouting at me and laughing at me, and you're not so tough now, Cross. And so that was how we dealt with emotions, is like brutal. So that's Bear Grylls. I interviewed this author, David Farrell, a couple of days ago. It will go live on Friday. Really fascinating conversation. Great book. Just finished reading it, and he talks about his South African, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe boarding school, Southern African boarding school experience. He says, "On the short walk to my chair, I dashed away a tear and pulled myself together. It wasn't safe to show emotions." And again, similar experiences. Emotions are not okay. So that's from there. And then Tina Brown, the Palace Papers here. This is talking about Kate, Princess of Wales. Says here, another alumni recalled Kate sitting on the stairs of her house. So this is while she was at Down House, which was a boarding school, although she was a day pupil. Says sitting on the stairs of her house crying her eyes out. Head teacher Cameron, who sounds like a corporate version of Roald Dahl's Miss Trunchbull, defended the school in words that made Kate sound like a wet blanket. The girls, she said, were encouraged to play to their strengths. It could be difficult if you were a shrinking violet type. It was so bad, Kate developed stress eczema. Carol and Michael Middleton whipped her out of there fast in the middle of the year. So that's just another expression of that. I've got Tony Blair as well. He says in here, again, I've referenced this point. Okay, this is his autobiography, and he says here, in many ways, I'm very emotionally self-sufficient. In some ways, too much so. I make emotional commitment because it comes naturally to me, but I fear it also. The loss of control, and the fact that the consequences of caring can be painful. Fear the dependence, perhaps fear learning the lessons from love that goes wrong, that human nature is frail and unreliable after all. So for me, that shows someone who's not emotionally intelligent, who doesn't know how to deal with his emotions. And I could see that when he was in government personally. So, it's just this sense of the IQ is talked about, it's developed in these schools. But if that's going to be taken over by AI, what's going to be important is the EQ, that 80%. And I was saying this to someone yesterday, it's almost like these schools take us to 20%. Yes, they might get us our jobs, might get us into certain industries, but they don't help us to thrive. And again, quoting the Daniel Goleman again, he says, IQ gets you into the job, but it's EQ that gives you outstanding performance, and it makes you into a leader. Because what's leadership? Again, as Kuzin and Posner talk about in this book here, they say leadership's all about relationships, but you learn in these schools that you break the attachment, relationships are not important. So I can kind of really see that. And Kuzin and Posner, again, they talk about empathy. Empathy is a key trait of a great leader. But we learn in these schools, if we can't have empathy for ourselves, how can we have empathy for others? Yeah. So, next bit I wanted to read out was just from Daniel Goleman's book. And as I was reading it, I was like, wow, that sounds just like an ex-border. And he basically saying about the difference between people with high IQ but low emotional intelligence, and then people with high emotional intelligence. And as I was reading this, I read this to a friend, a colleague yesterday, and he's like, wow, that just sounds like a boarding school survivor. And I'll read Nick's piece as well. So the high IQ pure type, that is setting aside emotional intelligence, is almost a caricature of the intellectual adept in the realm of mind, but inept in the personal world. The profiles differ slightly for men and women. I'll read both out. The high IQ male is typified, no surprise, by a wide range of intellectual interests and abilities. He is ambitious and productive, predictable and dogged, and untroubled by concerns about himself. He also tends to be critical and condescending, fastidious and inhibited, uneasy with sexuality and sensual experience, unexpressive and detached, and emotionally bland and cold. And as I read that, I'm like, wow, that just sounds like a boarding school survivor. It's very much the same definitions. Purely high IQ women have the expected intellectual confidence, are fluent in expressing their thoughts, value intellectual matters, and have a wide range of intellectual and aesthetic interests. They also tend to be introspective, prone to anxiety, rumination, and guilt, and hesitate to express their anger openly, though they do so indirectly. So I just see that as I read that, it's like, well, that just sounds like boarding school survivors. There's no emotional quotient in there. So with very high IQ, cognitive, but no connection to our emotions. And if I can remember where Nick talks about that, I think it's page 60 in this book here, Trauma, Abandonment, and Privilege. He just talks about some of the traits. Yeah, so this, linking into that high IQ, ex-boarders will often have a very competent exterior, but it is built on survival strategies adopted many years ago to cope with feelings of loss of being abandoned very young to an institution. Faced with the inevitable losses that belong to adult life, the competent exterior of an ex-boarder reveals itself as brittle. It will sometimes begin to fracture. Perhaps the most common facet or symptom of an ex-boarder can be described as emotional absence. Cognitively, they may be razor sharp, but emotionally they can be rank beginners. Inevitably, an inability to deal with anything emotional makes the business of intimate relationships a veritable minefield for ex-boarders. So for me, as I study more about leadership, I've been reading 5 or 6 of some of the top leadership books over the last 20, 30 years, all talk about emotional intelligence. In order to be a great leader, we're moving away from this command and control. You'll do as I say, again, get Daniel Goleman. I'll put a link to the video in the description, but he just says that might work for a quarter. And I was speaking to Zena Me in my podcast last year, and she said, often the CEOs, the ex-boarding school CEOs that she works with, that they will last a year or two. It's like in these positions, because it's impossible to keep that going. In order to really have people on your side, then you've got to have that emotion, you've got to have that connection, you've got to be able to develop relationships. And if you've learned that relationships are not important, as we do in these schools, then this means being a leader is very difficult. What other things? So I think I'll just wrap this up here. It's been a longish video, but I think just IQ might well be replaced by AI, but EQ will never be. These schools haven't, until now, they're no interested in EQ. And therefore the IQ, if it does get replaced by AI, well, will there be any purpose for them? My question is possibly not, unless they change, unless they pivot and they start to go, and I think it's very difficult to develop EQ if you've broken the attachment with parents. So therefore, for me, they have to pivot into day schools until 16. 16, you've developed that emotional intelligence, but even at 16, you still have to have that emotional intelligence if it's a boarding school. But you've got to have parents. You develop empathy, self-reflection, these things. The parents help to do that. The community helps to do that. And I'll finish here with Yuval Noah Harari, who has written many books, but in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, he says, so what should we be teaching? Many pedagogical experts argue that schools should switch to teaching the 4 C's: critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. But he says, to survive and flourish in such a world, you will need a lot of mental flexibility and great reserves of emotional balance. You will have to repeatedly let go of some of what you know best and learn to feel at home in the unknown. So just kind of there. So just some ideas. I'm just kind of bringing them in, but it's just fascinating. Could this be the finish of boarding schools because of AI? Possibly. Certainly my vision next 10 years, as you've heard before, is for us to start closing these schools down, converting them into sixth form colleges, creating a new generation of leaders who are emotionally intelligent, who can bring us forward into the future. So, so podcast with, his name David Farrell, will go live on Friday, and possibly got a podcast on Friday with a producer writer of a New Zealand documentary about boarding schools again, and yeah, some great conversations coming up. So thank you for listening, and yeah, please do tell me what you think, whether this resonates or not, any thoughts you have. So thank you for listening. Take care. Bye for now.